Thanks for joining us for the second panel of today's conference, where we're going to be exploring and dissecting the counterinsurgency strategy that defined the last 20 years of the war in Afghanistan and ask the bigger question, could it possibly have succeeded? My name is Adam Weinstein, and I'm going to be the host of this panel. I'm a research fellow at the Quincy Institute, and I'm also a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, where I deployed as a U.S. Marine in 2012. And I'm joined by three experts who have viewed the war from three different vantage points. One as a journalist, one as a diplomatic advisor and an academic, and one as a military advisor. And so if you excuse me, I'm going to read their bios because their biographies are actually so extensive that I don't want to miss anything. First, we're joined by Azmat Khan, and she's an award-winning journalist, a New York Times Magazine contributing writer, a Carnegie Fellow, and an assistant professor of journalism at Columbia University, where she will also lead a Center for Global Journalism, which is a new center that Columbia will have. She is currently writing a book for Random House that investigates America's air wars. And her 2015 investigation for BuzzFeed News into Afghanistan demonstrated that the US touted achievements in boosting education in war-torn Afghanistan were grossly exaggerated. So she's going to join us to talk about some of what she has observed in the counterinsurgency campaign. Next, we'll be joined by Dr. Barnett Rubin, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Quincy Institute and a senior fellow at NYU's Center for International Cooperation, where he previously directed the Afghanistan-Pakistan Regional Program. He previously served as senior advisor to the UN, where he advised on the Bonn conference. He also served as an advisor to the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the US Department of State. And during negotiations that produced the Bonn Agreement, and also during the drafting of the 2004 Afghan Constitution, he was a key advisor. His most recent book, Afghanistan, What Everyone Needs to Know, was published last year. And if you're going to read one book on Afghanistan to introduce you to the complex history of the country, I would recommend this one. And last but not least, we're joined by Dr. Carter Malkasian. He's the author of the recent book, The American War in Afghanistan, A History. It just came out. I highly recommend everyone read it. He was the special assistant for strategy to Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Joseph Dunford from 2015 to 2019. So he's been intimately involved in the Afghanistan policy of the last several years. He also spent 2 years in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, as a State Department political officer, and he deployed to Iraq twice as part of the Center for Naval Analyses as a civilian advisor for the Marines, and he's currently a research analyst at CNA. So we're going to jump right into questions here. All three of you have criticized the counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan in some form, and you've criticized the broader war effort. And this is a big question, so I know it's going to be hard to answer. But in your views, when and how did the US war effort, especially the counterinsurgency campaign, first go off the rails in Afghanistan? And I'd like to start with Barnett.
Well, thank you for that, Adam. I just want to start with something else, which is, the past 2 weeks have been very, very difficult for Afghans and for those of us who have been working on Afghanistan for the past 20 years. And I'd have to say that there'll be debate about this for a long time, but I cannot get away from the feeling that the United States fundamentally betrayed the people of Afghanistan, not by finally leaving or talking to the Taliban, but by, throughout those 20 years, making promises that were impossible to keep, but that the people of Afghanistan believed, and codifying those promises in agreements like the bilateral security agreement and declaration of strategic partnership that did not take into account the reality, not only the realities of Afghanistan, but the realities of the United States. Sun Tzu said, know your enemy, know yourself, and then you'll succeed. We did not do either of those things. Now, When we first went off the rails, there's a wide variety of choices. One, looking back now, President Bush had said no nation building. And with the experience we have now, maybe we should say, if we don't know how to do nation building, which apparently we do not, and we don't have the tools to do it, which apparently do not, we should also get out of the business of government destroying, because international security requires that states somehow exist and be engageable in some way. So perhaps the mistake was the war, but that was probably unavoidable, given that, if you remember, September 11th and the emotions around it. However, we decided that the purpose of the war had nothing to do with Afghanistan. You see, the purpose of the war was to punish the people who carried out 9/11 and to demonstrate to everyone that if they harbored such people, they would also be punished. That meant peace in Afghanistan was not a consideration. In fact, it was a threat, because for most Afghans, I believe, they believed that the coming of the United States meant peace in Afghanistan. Many Taliban leaders surrendered and were in favor of that. They reached an agreement with President Karzai the day after the Bonn Agreement, which Donald Rumsfeld torpedoed on television. You can watch him doing it on CNN. And that was the beginning of the denial of peace. We were so strong that we didn't want to negotiate. Later, we said we can't negotiate until we're in a better position, until we finally ended up where we are today.
So if I could ask a quick follow-up. In the last panel, Anne-Marie said, we created reliance on us that was immoral. In other words, in Afghanistan, did we create a reliance on the United States military and United States funding and United States models of governance that was immoral? You've said that we made promises we couldn't keep. How much of that was related to creating a state that was permanently reliant upon us?
Yeah, she was exactly right, and that's what I thought of when she said that. Look, the policy, which you're calling counterinsurgency, but beyond that, in Afghanistan was essentially a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is one because there was no strategy for making Afghanistan self-reliant, or more self-reliant even. Making Afghanistan self-reliant, in fact, would have gone against all of our other foreign policies, because it requires cooperation with China, Russia, and Iran. Because Afghanistan is landlocked and its economy can grow only through cooperation with those countries. So it was doomed to failure. So what we did was, counterinsurgency is clear, hold, build, and then we added one, transfer, because we were not a colonial power, we thought, and therefore we were going to build up an Afghan government which would be self-sufficient and could take over.
If I could move on to Azmat, you viewed this war from the perspective of the civilian harm, and to compensate for the fact that our counterinsurgency strategy was not completely cohesive. I think we had an issue where we would empower local warlords who weren't necessarily the best partners to have on the ground. I was wondering if you could speak to that, and then also answer the original question about how you see the history of the U.S. counterinsurgency in Afghanistan and where it really went off the rails in your view.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I think the technical difficulty was my fault, so my apologies for that. But it's a pleasure to be here with these others. As was just said, there were key moments when, even before this war began, when there were overtures and offers from Mullah Omar through representatives to Robert Grenier, for example, in Pakistan at the time, to essentially hand over bin Laden to a third-party country, which Donald Rumsfeld rejected, right? It was this Bush administration that members of it routinely refused any kind of a surrender that wasn't unconditional. It happened before the bombing began. It happened as the bombing happened. There were refusals. And as the United States, found itself in Afghanistan, trying to capture bin Laden, trying to target al-Qaeda, they very quickly aligned themselves with individuals who had been so abusive in past wars, people who owned militias and militaries, people like Dostum and others, to essentially fight the Taliban. That is how they were able to really take Afghanistan early on. It's why the Taliban crumbled, but it also wed them to these individuals in ways that really, if you listen to the Afghanistan papers and you talk to US officials, you start to hear this narrative about how that was when the war really started to go off course, just at the very beginning. But I would say, just from the vantage point of civilians in these battlefield areas, the majority of areas where this war was fought, they will cite very early on incredible civilian casualty incidents. And so, within 8 months of the war, there was a bombing, a incredible civilian casualty incident on a wedding convoy in Uruzgan province in July of 2002. And can you just imagine, the impact that had on the ground if there are people, individuals who are being told that, this war is being fought to give people freedom and rights, and yet there are large-scale civilian losses. In many ways, the United States military knew very little about this country, about its groups. It allied themselves with individuals who were incredibly abusive, who were responsible in some ways for the Taliban's rise in the past. The Taliban came to power after incredible corruption, incredible abuses by many of these roving militias from the Mujahideen era, from the Soviet era. And some of these people who led to the Taliban's uprising in the first place then became American partners. And you saw them call in airstrikes on their rivals. You saw them essentially want to collect money from the United States military that was offering rewards for people who would turn in, Al-Qaeda or Taliban leaders. You saw this repeated throughout the war. And in my experience, this has had incredibly detrimental effects in many rural areas, battlefield areas, where people don't even necessarily support the Taliban. They found themselves at least resigning themselves to Taliban power simply because they found their aggression less violent than they found the US military's aggression. And, just to point out, when we think about, how America understood Afghanistan and how military officials, these young people who were being sent to that country, I read a reporter yesterday who had, I think, served 2 previous tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, I think. And, in this piece he'd written, he couldn't identify the language spoken. He called it Pashtun instead of Pashto. And that's the level of education that many people who were deployed to this country had, which was a very, very little understanding for local and cultural context. So, they really missed out on that civilian population.
Yeah, I served in Uruzgan province in 2012. And of course, Uruzgan province is also the site of Australian war crimes, which are still under investigation. And the videos can be viewed on the internet, and they're quite shocking. And I think it's true that the population in Uruzgan was alienated by the NATO mission and by US troops and our partners. I'm wondering if I could ask you a follow-up question, because you spoke about rural Afghanistan. And throughout much of the war, when we talk about gains, I think we've focused on Kabul and urban Afghanistan, and those gains are undeniable. Gains in maternal health, gains in education of women, in upward mobility in terms of jobs and economic status. And it's easy to exaggerate and downplay the dichotomy between rural Afghanistan and urban Afghanistan, because, of course, many Afghans in both the countryside and the cities had the same aspirations. They wanted to see their daughters educated. They wanted access to political choice. And yet the difference in how these communities, these 2 Afghanistans, so to speak, experienced the counterinsurgency can't be denied. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that difference and what it meant for the success of the US counterinsurgency strategy.
Mm-hmm. So, I want to be clear. It's not as simple as two Afghanistan's, urban and rural. I think there's even a lot of variance within rural communities. There are some rural communities that have been at peace and have not experienced the brunt of this war. Others that have primarily, suffered incredible economic disparities, but not necessarily experienced, the most intense battle. But I would say that about maybe 30% of the country is where the majority of the war in Afghanistan has been fought, in provinces like Helmand, Kandahar, Nangarhar, Kunar. And that was really where most US aid money and most deployments were focused. And so back in 2015, as the US had drawn down most of its soldiers in Afghanistan and was starting this new approach to the war, I was looking at the landscape of reporting about the country, and it was overwhelmingly negative at the time, with one exception, and that was education, which was largely seen as America's most positive legacy in the country. And so what I did was, as an investigative journalist, I acquired the GPS coordinates of every USAID funded or refurbished school in the country. I acquired military data about schools that it had built. And I did a sample of 50 US funded schools in 7 battlefield provinces, these places where the war for hearts and minds was the most intense, to see whether these grand claims, this progress made, really stacked up with the facts. And what I found was that 10% of these schools were either never built or no longer existed. A majority of them were falling apart. And as I started to dig into why, and also girls were undercounted in official statistics by 40%. And I also found data that showed that more than 1,100 schools in Afghanistan at the time were ghost schools that were open on the books and closed in real life. And yet the money was coming in and being taken for teachers, the operation of the school. That money was being pilfered. And I think it's undeniable, based on that kind of ground reporting, that in these battlefield areas, people have not seen the gains that were promised, the gains that you've seen in urban communities in terms of education, in terms of healthcare. What I found as I dug into, why was the school never completed, even though, the US military says it's open on the books? And you would find these really incredible corrupt dealings. And when you dug into why, well, it turns out they allied themselves with a particular warlord in the area, or a particular district governor, and he passed the contract on to his brother, for example. Or in one case, there was supposed to be a school in this little village of Nawabad in Kandahar. And when I arrived there, it was just mud. It was like a small mud school. And what was supposed to be there was a large functioning school with a boundary wall. And I did a little digging and found out that it was put in the village of Kandahar's police chief, Abdul Razak, where there was not a population of young children. And it didn't open for a number of years because there were no children to attend it. But guess who got the contract and got the money in terms of, and this happened repeatedly in these battlefield areas. And so it's very hard when not just journalists, but diplomats and others are drawing from the progress in urban areas to sell the myths of these wars. Whereas in a lot of these battlefield areas, you're seeing a completely different story, realities that just don't stack up with the claims that our government made.
So to recap, we enter Afghanistan in 2001, as Barnett Rubin pointed out, not to help Afghanistan, but in response to attacks from Al-Qaeda. Both of you have pointed out that we squander an opportunity to potentially have a political settlement between Karzai and the Taliban, and Donald Rumsfeld says no to that. We enter this military strategy that has no coherence. We partner with insidious warlords on the ground. The brunt of the fighting is happening in 30% of the country. And to paint a veneer over how horrible that situation is, we begin to have these USAID style projects, but they're not really effective. And so I want to take us to Carter now to discuss what were the flaws in the military strategy in Afghanistan. And if you could walk us through the early years, the surge, post 2014, and maybe the last couple of years, give us a 30,000 foot view of each of those points. I know that's a huge question, but I think it's important. Was the flaw consistently the same one, or did it change over time? I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. I'll do my best. And certainly the reasons for problems change over time. They're not the same. They shift about, and we shouldn't expect them to change to be the same over time. So when we start in Afghanistan, I'm gonna take the 2001 period and just put that aside and talk about, once the Taliban have been toppled, what do we see the strategy to be? And our foremost goal at that time is to complete the defeat of Al-Qaeda, and also at that time was to complete the defeat of the Taliban. But there wasn't really anything to be called counterinsurgency at the time. The phrase wasn't really even that well known at the time. Really what was happening more is some of what Azmat was referring to, which is that we had special operations forces and other forces on the ground that were focused on targeting insurgent leaders and focusing on going after them in various locations. So the famous July 2002 Uruzgan strike was a result of one of these operations where they thought Mullah Omar might be in the vicinity, conducted an attack, and instead killed a number of civilians. Similar attacks happened in other parts of the country. The most famous is against Burgat Khan, Issaaqzai tribesman in Maywand, and after he was captured, detained, and died in detention, lots of his tribe decided to turn against the government and turn against us. So those are events that are fairly well known and highly problematic. That focus on targeting leadership and going after remnants of Taliban and remnants of Al-Qaeda, that continues for 3 or 4 years. Many Taliban leaders who were trying to live in peace were incidentally targeted, accidentally targeted, or purposely targeted. And some of them will go back to Pakistan and now support the Taliban movement. So that's that period. Now, over time, there's the thought that, well, we're going to need to have a different strategy, that this isn't working so well. And that really comes to a fore in 2005, 2006, where the Taliban are starting to reorganize, reform, and launch new attacks inside of Afghanistan. And that creates some impetus to creating change. And so at that time, the counterterrorism strategy becomes complemented by a conventional strategy. And during the early period of 2006 to 2009, it tried to kind of make it counterinsurgency, but it was really more about military operations to try to root out Taliban, especially in eastern Afghanistan, especially in northeastern areas such as Kunar, Nuristan, where we had lots of bases set up in some very remote areas and got in some extremely intense fighting, a lot of which didn't really look like counterinsurgency or insurgency at all. It looked like some kind of video from the Korean War at times. And so, Wesley Morgan's book is The Hardest War is fantastic on this piece. So counterinsurgency starts to get implemented from 2009 to 2000, really in 2009. The Obama administration kind of gives the okay for that after some really extended, difficult debate. And counterinsurgency is taken from the perceived successes of Iraq. And it's implemented in Afghanistan. And under President Obama, it's actually, the idea is not to defeat the Taliban, it's to break their momentum, to complete the defeat of Al-Qaeda and enable the Afghan government to stand on its own. As Professor Rubin has said, that probably wasn't really in the cards. So the surge goes forward for those years. I think in a variety of places and districts and locations, it was tactically successful, but its strategic effect is what's much more important. The majority of U.S. casualties occurred during that time. Costs are approximately $100 billion per year, and that is simply unsustainable. So instead of the surge enabling us to stay longer, enabling the Afghan government to better stand on its own, it probably accelerated our withdrawal. And that leads to the next stage of U.S. strategy, where President Obama, after some extraordinary effort, manages to reduce U.S. forces in Afghanistan from that 100,000 to something closer to 10,000, give or take. And he also changes the strategy, such as that the ideas of counterinsurgency are no longer so present, and it looks more like counterterrorism and advising the Afghan forces. That war with that strategy basically goes on until you could end it in February of 2020, the US Taliban agreement. You could take it a little bit longer than that, but it goes to nearly the end of the conflict. So those are kind of the stages of US strategy through it. You asked, when did we go off the rails? I think the one thing I'd add to that is I'm not sure I could say we ever went off the rails as much as success was never really possible, or the opportunities for it were extremely slim. That's not to absolve the many mistakes that were made, any more than our likely failure in Vietnam should absolve those who committed the My Lai massacre. It's simply to realize the difficulty of the situation that existed, and perhaps the naivety of thinking that we could ever achieve something different.
I served in Afghanistan at the tail end of the surge in 2012. And I remember that at that point, we were already beginning to use the talking points that we're in an advisory role, even though it was official in 2014, but we're in an advisory role and the Afghans are taking the lead. And that absolutely was not true for the provincial police or the Afghan army. It was true for some of the commando units. But basically what would happen is we would take the Afghan police or the regular army out on easy patrols where we thought nothing would happen. And we were still leading, by the way. And if there was any mission of consequence, we either took no Afghans or we took the commandos. And that's how it played out. But that's not how it was really sold to the American public or even lawmakers. And so I think we succeeded in fostering a special operations capability in the Afghan military, but not the conventional forces. And of course, you can't win a counterinsurgency or hand over responsibility for the country's security to a military that's completely reliant on a very small subset of its military forces. Is that right?
Well, no, you can't hand it off entirely just to the commando forces that are there. And I think there's no question that the Afghan forces were always reliant on us. We could see that. You could certainly see that when you were there. In 13 and 14, when I was there, it was clear that in a number of in nearly any engagement the Afghans were in without our support, that they had great difficulty succeeding and often were defeated. So this problem existed for a long time in the forces. There's a question now of could we have done something different to build forces that were better, to build forces that were more capable, that were less reliant on us. I'm actually not sure if that's the case. I think the reasons for them having difficulty in their combat operations are deeper in the kind of things that is extremely difficult for us to fix. Corruption is a hard thing to change in a country. That doesn't mean we should have gone along with it in any ways, but we should be aware that rooting that out of an armed forces or in a government is not something that is simple to do. That's a very heady task. On the problems that creates with morale, the other problems with morale that exist are also hard to remove. The Taliban have a certain advantage. They're fighting the occupier. They're conducting resistance to occupation. That's something that's much deeper ingrained in Afghan identity than working with the foreign occupier. So the Taliban have a base of morale that the Afghan forces didn't have. And all of this only raises the bar, makes it more difficult to create any kind of long-term change in Afghanistan.
If I could jump in actually to something that was just said about corruption and a trend that I don't think gets talked about often enough is the shift in how the military operates and its shift towards more privatization, meaning that, by the time these wars rolled around or the war in Afghanistan started, the United States military was often outsourcing many of its projects to companies, contractors, others to do that kind of work. It's what really, I think, in some ways contributed to a large amount of the corruption, not all of it, certainly. But that kind of outsourcing, that kind of privatization, this more neoliberal economic model of operating is also something that needs to be talked about. But I don't hear enough people really talking about that with respect to how this war may have gone differently.
May I say something? We couldn't combat corruption because we were the source of it. The first thing the United States did in the war in Afghanistan was took a helicopter to the Panjshir Valley and gave them a knapsack with $1 million and $100 bills. Okay, and that's how the CIA was operating. I'm not criticizing the CIA, where they were assigned that task, but a lot of the war was conducted through things that looked at from a law enforcement point of view are corruption. Second, you cannot hand off a country to its armed forces, no matter how well trained they are. As Napoleon said, you can do anything with bayonets except sit on them. The country has to have a government, and you can't make that government independent and self-reliant by giving it more and more aid. It has the opposite effect. We never took into account one basic fact, which I want to mention, how poor Afghanistan is. Afghanistan is the poorest country in Asia. Did you know Afghanistan is poorer on a per capita basis than Haiti? Okay? And we tried to build institutions that it could never possibly afford. With the low literacy rate that it had, it could never possibly operate it. The Afghans are perfectly capable of doing all kinds of things, fighting, running war, but they couldn't operate our institutions. They couldn't fund our institutions. So we did what we knew how to do, and what we knew how to do was doomed to fail in Afghanistan.
And a microcosm of that I experienced was trying to teach some of the regular Afghan soldiers how to use a radio. But they didn't know how. We had these laminated cards actually that were in Dari and Pashto for the parts of the radio, but none of them could read it. And they didn't know arithmetic. So of course, teaching radio frequencies was difficult. And I remember standing outside a shed that housed the radios, and one of the soldiers handing me some heroin and asking if I wanted it. So this was what teaching basic military skills what was like in Afghanistan. And of course, US Marines and US soldiers, especially outside of special forces, weren't really equipped to do that. And so it couldn't be done at scale. And what I've heard earlier from Carter is that we were sort of oscillating between a CT mission and a counterinsurgency mission. But because we didn't have a self-reliant partner in Kabul in the Afghan government, and because we didn't have an Afghan military that could stand in its own 2 feet, the CT mission became coupled with the counterinsurgency mission and some of the nation building aspects. So in other words, to continue the CT mission, the prevailing logic became that we had to continue the counterinsurgency mission. But Azmat, you've argued that combination was counterproductive in many ways. In fact, you said that the counterterrorism mission was baked into every aspect of the Afghanistan project for the United States in a way that really undermined our ability to win hearts and minds. And of course, winning hearts and minds and building up the Afghan government was a key pillar of the counterinsurgency strategy. So I'm wondering if you could speak more to that.
Yeah, and these aren't even arguments. My job is as a reporter, it was based on, ground reporting and speaking to those on the inside of a lot of these projects. And, there was one USAID official who told me, look, Azmat, we needed good numbers. We needed a win. And there was such pressure on pushing for these projects for the purposes of, at the beginning, it was to prop up Karzai in his first election. They were trying to meet these metrics. They needed good numbers. They needed a win. They needed to have X many schools and clinics completed before he was put forth, in this election, so they can show the Afghan people, look at what we've accomplished. And so to do that, they cut a lot of corners. They worked with a lot of people, and this replicated itself over and over and over, where there was baked into every kind of effort, even the ones that might be the most noble, things like schools, health clinics. Maternal mortality was an incredible problem, but at every single factor here, there was this counterterrorism mission baked into it. They needed great numbers. They needed to tout these successes. And what it wound up doing, was that in places like, for example, Zabul, where there were a large number of ghost schools, the largest number of ghost schools in the data that I had were in Zabul. And lots of people there, as they were trying to figure out where this money was going, they believed it was going into the hands of the Taliban, right? So imagine how disenfranchised people in these areas where these projects are, not just intended to be helping, and it's not just that their goals are not materializing necessarily, it's that they were actively undercutting the legitimacy that these projects were intended to promote. So the idea that that kind of marriage of political and military goals and this kind of humanitarian assistance and these efforts, these noble efforts in many of these places, it really went awry. It often had the opposite effect. It often, there's just to break down one example. When we think about this, let me just share one example of the cost of something as small as a $100,000 contract. I went to this school in Deba, Kandahar. I turned up, it was incomplete, falling apart. It had never opened. It had never seen a single student. When I figured out what happened, it turned out that, the contract had gone to the brother of the district governor in Dund, and he'd pilfered it. And the kids at this school who were supposed to be attending this school, I found them across the street at a mosque, spilled out, 50 or so of them spilled out onto the grass, rocking back and forth, reading the Quran. The girls only got a religious education. The boys had, a UNICEF teacher that came once a week to teach them, regular curriculum. And there was a teacher walking around with a stick who told me, I just do this to encourage them, and a little child piped up, if there is no beating, there is no learning. Right? This was one $100,000 contract that was pilfered. Now just imagine the billions that have been stolen or pilfered and across the country, as the United States injected massive amounts of money, allied itself with warlords, had to look the other way. The United States knew that district governor funneled projects through his brother. I acquired a US intelligence assessment that showed that they knew, but they really couldn't do anything about it because he was their man on the ground. Now that happened over and over and over. And how can you expect many of these things intended to win hearts and minds to do that when they're actively also allied with individuals who have been breaking the hearts and minds of Afghans for generations?
Adam, can I add something? I would like to draw a link to some of the discussion on the previous panel. And in particular to the link to the argument, which I very much agree with, that conceiving foreign policy and national security policy primarily as zero-sum conflict and not in order to attain and achieve and retain dominance, rather than as a quest for cooperation in order to solve global problems, is one of the factors that has undermined our efforts in Afghanistan. Because the way that the United States went into Afghanistan originally was it was so desperate, it was so angry after 9/11 that we cooperated with Iran and Russia. And that is how we managed to do what we originally did. And then we immediately, shook that off, and President Bush gave the axis of evil speech. Afghanistan is landlocked. Today, people, as you pointed out, in President Biden's speech, he talked about we have to pivot from Afghanistan to competing with China. Well, Afghanistan cannot recover and become self-reliant without cooperation with China. Just as Anne-Marie Slaughter mentioned, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that's a bank that could invest in Afghanistan that we're boycotting because of the role of China. And in fact, if we now shift our policy to great power competition in Afghanistan, we will destroy Afghanistan once again under a different slogan. And so Afghanistan is a problem, smaller in scale perhaps, but it's like climate change. It's like pandemics. We cannot solve it without actively cooperating with countries that we have identified as our enemies and our competitors.
Do you think it's safe to say that one of the flaws of the counterinsurgency strategy was that it placed Afghanistan in a vacuum in which we were trying to outright defeat the Taliban? Carter has said we were trying to manage the Taliban. I think it depends who you asked what the strategy was, but we were trying to either manage or defeat the Taliban, all the while we prioritized a CT mission where the goal was to completely defeat Al-Qaeda, but we didn't have a coherent regional strategy, which made us disproportionately reliant on Pakistan. We didn't have the cooperation of Iran, which could have been a natural partner. Does that account for some of the flaws in our counterinsurgency strategy on the ground?
Well, first, let me just tell you an anecdote about defeating versus managing the Taliban. During the policy review in 2009, there was a discussion where General McChrystal presented a paper which it said, this is what we need in order to defeat the Taliban. And Richard Holbrooke, who was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, for whom I was working at the time, said, whoa, defeat the Taliban. I thought we had decided we weren't going to do that. We're going to just break their momentum. And so McChrystal said, okay, I'll change that. So he changed it to break the momentum of the Taliban. And so Holbrooke said, okay, so if your goal is to break the momentum of the Taliban and not to defeat them, does that change in any way the resources that you need? And he said, absolutely not. So, they changed the words, but they didn't really change what they were doing. Now, as for the regional strategy, basically Pakistan was supporting the Taliban, and our logistics into Afghanistan were dependent on Taliban, on Pakistan, and our covert war against Al Qaeda in the region also depended on cooperation with the anti-terrorist part of ISI, the Pakistan Intelligence Agency, while the pro-terrorist part of the ISI was helping to support the Taliban. And there was nothing we could really do about it because of our antagonism to Iran. We had a route through Russia and Central Asia at one time for about a year when Pakistan cut off the ground links. But since then, we have put the railroads that we used for that supply route under sanctions because of Russia's policy in Ukraine. I'm not saying we shouldn't have done that, but the fact is all the approaches to Afghanistan by land and air are controlled by Pakistan, Iran, and Russia. The major economy in the region is China, which could provide the dynamism for the revival of its economy. If you don't cooperate with those countries, you cannot do anything in Afghanistan.
I'd like to take us back for a moment to the ground level of this counterinsurgency and the CT campaign, for that matter, because there was a common denominator between both the CT campaign and the counterinsurgency, and that was airstrikes and the air war. And Azmat and Carter, you have both written and talked about how the US CT and counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan became increasingly reliant on airstrikes. And a lot of proponents of a so-called sustainable presence in Afghanistan and the idea that we could just stay there militarily indefinitely have talked about the low cost of staying. But Azmat, you frequently talked about how in 2019, there were more bombs dropped in Afghanistan than any of the years prior.
Right.
We also see that casualties of both the ANDSF and civilians were rising. So I'm wondering if Azmat, you can speak to both the effect that had on the people of Afghanistan and why the Pentagon and the White House still saw it as a attractive strategy despite its clear human cost.
When people say those are low cost, you have to ask low costs for whom? And what they mean is it's low cost or lower cost for US military lives, right? So in 2015, when when Resolute Support, this new mission, began in Afghanistan, the United States was relying far less on combat operations. In fact, there were very few, and primarily on air support, right? That's how we conducted that war 2015 forward. And in that time, before the Kabul airport attack, there were 64 hostile deaths of US service members in the last 6 years. At the same time, there were large numbers of suicide among soldiers was almost equal to that. These are much smaller numbers of U.S. service member deaths than had been the case when the U.S. was involved in combat operations. And so when they say low cost, they're talking about American service member lives. They're not talking about foreign civilians, right, to whom we have shifted those costs onto. And they're not talking about partner forces' lives. The Afghan security forces have lost tens of thousands. We don't know the true number, but they were losing their lives in incredible numbers, even with US air support, right? The United States has been providing them air support. It was unprecedented in levels in 2019. And at the same time, in 2019, you saw the American public and American news media less invested in coverage of this war than ever before. There are notable exceptions in terms of some news organizations that maintained strong commitments throughout the war. But for the most part, it receded from the spotlight. So when people say low cost, they don't just mean US service members' lives, but they mean low political cost, right? These administrations have not had to suffer some of the blowback that administrations in the past suffered when they were waging this war in ways that might be more overt to the American public, although no less overt on the ground, right? For Afghan people, for those civilians. And I will say that it's not always the case that civilian casualty incidents alone turn people against populations. I would say that, my own civilian casualty reporting in Iraq has showed a different story. But in Afghanistan, what I've seen is that these have taken place in such large numbers, and I would actually argue that they've been incredibly undercounted. So when we cite these official statistics about civilian casualties that were the result of the Taliban versus the result of the US and its allied forces, I think there's an extensive body of reporting shaping up now to show that those numbers were inaccurate for years, in large part because people were not going into these battlefield areas. When you go there, you'll see that everyone has stories. I've met children who've never known, they grew up after this invasion, but they've never known peace in their entire lives. Young boys and girls who never had access to a proper education, didn't get proper health treatment throughout their lives. They never saw these gains. And at the same time, they suffered family losses that haunted them for years. That really explains the Taliban's rise. People have been so surprised by how swiftly the country fell. I was surprised by how quickly Kabul fell. But in many parts of the rest of the country, I was not surprised to see that when you take away that air support, which was, what allowed the Afghan government to maintain its tenuous hold in the country, and at the same time, you have the effects of that air support, which is really to turn people against that government or to support other sides, you are going to see the Taliban rise pretty quickly. You're going to see Afghan national security forces who no longer have that air support. It means certain death for them. It's really readily explainable by this US approach to war.
Carter, Azmat just outlined the human cost of the air war. Do you think the air war, the kind of air-driven campaign we've seen over the last couple of years, was sustainable for the United States as a model? And also, you were one of the folks who said, look, without air support, Kabul is likely to fall. I think we were all surprised at the rapidity of that, but you did say that it was likely. And so what does that tell us about the counterinsurgency strategy and the partner force? And as Barnett Rubin eloquently said, the government that we were trying to hand over the country to. So I guess it's a two-part question, sorry. Was the air war sustainable? And what does the rapid collapse of the Afghan government after we removed air support tell us about counterinsurgency?
I think the most important thing to remember, for Afghanistan is that the likelihood that the government was going to stand on its own was pretty low. And if we wanted them to stay, if we wanted them to stand and we wanted that democratic government to continue, we were going to have to stay. And we're going to have to be there for a long time. On airstrikes, were, as Azmat has talked about, were a part of that. So if we were going to keep on doing this, we're going to have to stay for a long time. We were going to have to continue paying costs. Were they sustainable costs? It depends what angle you're looking at, and that depends on where you want something between $20 to $40 billion a year spent. People have argued it was sustainable, and so it's probably worth looking at. But the more important thing here to understand is that if you wanted Afghanistan to stand up on its own, that meant staying there and not leaving, paying those costs year after year with the damages to civilians, with the Afghan forces not improving, with the Taliban continuing to fight and with continued risk of US casualties associated with that. Or you can take some pause from that and you can think, is that worth it? And is it better to get out? So that's the kind of question people should have about military strategy in general when it comes to intervention. Understanding that going into a country is going to mean that you're going to have to be there for a long time and pay the associated costs. That should compel people, strategists, policymakers, not to want to have a strategy that's extremely expensive like the surge and want to have something that's cheaper. But it should also compel them to think about, should we even be there in the first place, or should we just stay out? There really isn't much good we can do over the long term unless we're willing to stay for a long period of time, and that's expensive. So I suspect that's not a very satisfying answer, but from the strategic level, that's kind of how I see that.
And we're not talking about just a few years here. We're talking about decades. Am I right in thinking that?
So people don't like the term, don't like the phrase that this is like term life insurance. President Trump kind of objected to, and people don't like it so much. But that is actually a good way to think about it. When you stop paying, when you stop being there, the changes you've made are likely to dissipate. And why is that? That's because the things that we are trying to overcome are so intractable and so difficult and so hard to change. There's a reason that the Taliban were in power in the 90s. There's a reason that a decent number of Afghans supported them. Those reasons return once we leave. So when I look out as a trying to be reasonable about things, I'm not willing to say, oh, it's 10 years or 20 years. It's if you want to keep terrorism down, if you want to achieve your objectives, you're going to have to be there. You're going to have to be there year after year after year, and you should expect that when you depart, that those things are going to change. Maybe the international context will be so different in 20 to 30 years that won't matter. But I'm also not willing to project out 20 or 30 years and say, well, stay 20 or 30 years, then everything will be okay. I don't have any grounds for that.
I'd add one thing. That our stay in Afghanistan depends on the neighbors of Afghanistan because it is landlocked. So, the first diplomatic thing we did after 9/11 was to put the squeeze on Pakistan to let us use their bases and their airspace. Pakistan is not as dependent on the United States as it was in 2001 because of the rise of China. And I don't think we're going to be getting the use of the airspace of Iran or Russia and the countries of Central Asia that depend on Russia for their security anytime soon.
And of course, just as different regional actors had a say, so did different demographics of Afghans. And we often hear this idea of listen to Afghans, and I think that is important, but it also depends which Afghans you listen to. And Afghans, of course, are not a monolith, and depending on which Afghans you talk to, you'll hear different things, aside from a general desire for there to be an end to war and bloodshed. We only have about 4 minutes left. And so I want to ask a big question that, unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask all of you to answer in brief, big picture terms. We've heard throughout this discussion on counterinsurgency, which became linked to regional politics and also to the CT mission, various missteps, the empowerment of warlords, the fact we engaged in nation building activities and aid projects that weren't effective, airstrikes that killed civilians, lack of a coherent or clear end state that we wanted to achieve, alienating potential partners like Iran, relying on the ISI, even though it was behaving in a two-faced manner. All of these things that we had to do to sustain this flawed counterinsurgency strategy, in my view. Given that, was there any way that the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan could have succeeded at the goals we wanted, or that were outlined by the generals? Was there any way it could have succeeded? And is it worth pursuing in the future in other conflicts in other countries, or does it come at too high of a cost, as Carter outlined in his metaphor about term life insurance? Is the cost simply too high to make it worth pursuing? So I'll start with Azmat. If you can keep your answers to 1 minute, that would be great.
It's difficult for me to say, how something could have gone differently as an investigative reporter, as a journalist. But what I can say is that there were fundamental flaws, from the very start of this war throughout it, and it continued today. And personally, what I think, in recent years has been an incredible problem within even just the journalism industry is the way in which when this air war started to, when the United States shifted towards primarily conducting its operations via aerial support, that news organizations and journalists covered it less, meaning that some of that essential context that's necessary for having an informed debate about this withdrawal, the American public doesn't have it, right? Instead, they're waking up to this war in Afghanistan through scenes at the Kabul airport, really horrific, terrible scenes, not the context of the last several years in which, if you just even rewind back to the coverage or the way that the media covered this war in 2014, it was one that largely reflected a lot of failures.
Next, as you may have heard, we're going to be joined by Senator Murphy, who's going to speak with QI's president, Andrew Bacevich. So I want to thank the panelists who have joined. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I think it's just part of doing a Zoom conference. But I learned so much from all of you. And to those who are listening, I hope you please stay tuned to listen to Andrew Bacevich's discussion with Senator Murphy.